Very happy to be here, so thank you all for coming at such an early hour. Surprised to see some of you so early. This paper, work in progress, entitled Rajendra Singh Bedi as Moral Philosopher, Domesticity as Political Frontier, was first occasioned by an invitation I received to deliver the Harjit Kaur Sidhu Memorial Lecture at the University of British Columbia last year, just right after the rapes in Delhi and elsewhere. The late Ms. Sidhu's commitment to the education of women in Punjab and elsewhere drew me towards the logic of the passive revolution that characterizes so many post-colonial societies today, a logic whereby initial hesitant intentions give way to an intractable movement towards radical experimentation, whereby a subject sheds internally the social world that still encloses it. In other words, a situation of subjective distanciation to which the social world responds in return to retard revolutionary practice. The dynamics of active and passive revolution in Punjab produced a sharp temporal disjuncture between modern subjectivity, or modern subjective norms, generally liberal, and social relations premised on kinship, especially on the gender axis maintained by the colonial state as customary law. The very dynamic is not peculiar by any means to modernity in the colonial world. Is it not to be expected now that the commitment and activities of the likes of Ms. Sidhu, the late Ms. Sidhu, to enhance the intellectual development of women in a patriarchal society would lead inevitably to the question of gender inequality everywhere? That's sort of the logic of this kind of phenomenon. In response, the passive revolution produces rape as an expression of the slow and comfortable withering of a habitus that can no longer be taken for granted. The socially impelled conflicts that tear through the public in contemporary India lead to ever greater moral murkiness as they exhaust the traditions currently making up Indian civilization of viable solutions to these very problems. What all the crises that characterize Indian society have begun to faintly map out now, in other words, is a horizon beyond the reach of traditional or neo-traditional innovation. So I think that's a real interesting problem to observe and track. It is this very possibility, whatever its attendant controversies, that I would like to explore with you today through an investigation into the literary and filmic legacy of Rajendra Singh Bedi. So I won't really get to, but you'll see sort of where he belongs in this intellectual trajectory. Bedi's career in the spheres of radio, literature, and film participate in that long search for a decolonized future that in India lasted from the independence movement to the emergency, and for reasons which I will explore later, went under the name of progressivism. This period may be grasped as one of a long and even revolution. Though generally in the passive modality, revolution occasionally flared up in the active form as well over this stretch. In the active modality, revolution took shape most dramatically as experimentation with new forms of selfhood and sharing of political power on that basis, experimentations, as mentioned, that always threatened to exceed the grasp of those who put them into motion. As passive, revolutionists experience as a slow erosion and terminal crisis that customary norms will undergo in the face of the market, civil society, and the political demands that they make exigent. What is remarkable about the work of Bedi, once one brushes off the dusty criticism that has enveloped it for so long, as I argue, is the extent to which it speaks to the inevitability of violence and conflict once one is caught in the crucible of vast social transformation, so it's inevitable at some level. His insights into the inertia of familial structures, the habitus of patriarchy, and the apparent weight of custom were worked out, it seems, through his activity in the Progressive Writers Association, or Taraki Pasand Adab, a loosely organized cultural front of the left spanning the decades before and after independence. Bedi's work affords a look into the difficulties radical modernism on the one hand and the inheritance of everyday domestic, especially female misery on the other, presented to each other in early decolonization, so this kind of tension. I want to suggest that what animates Bedi's writings is an insight into the economy between the passive and the active modes of revolutionary experience. The more colonial and post-colonial states impede active transformative praxis, the more violence will be unleashed in the passive form, as futile but vehement resistance to the inevitability of change. So there are three major works, Madhumati, Abhiman, and Ek Chadar Malisi, that I look at this, but I won't go into those too much. And what he explores, you could say, in essence, is the possibility of the reversal of patriarchy in domestic spheres. So I'll just talk a bit about active and passive revolution and cultural form in colonial Punjab as a kind of lead up to that, and leave off there. Though his looming statue has long been removed from the grounds of the Lahore High Court, the shadow of Sir John Lawrence, first Governor General of Punjab, cast over colonial history, remains dark and distinguishable. The infamous question on its plinth, will he be governed by pen or sword, spells out the stark non-choices given to the governed under his high command. The question indicates a readiness to resort to the sword to maintain the imperial peace, which Lawrence wields in one hand. The pen in Lawrence's other is emblematic of the Punjab school's commitment to the roughly hewn justice, often dispensed on the spot with all its attentiveness to local precedent for settling disputes, often with few traces left on the colonial record. The life of Lord Lawrence, told over 2 long volumes, would celebrate imperial virtue, including paternalistic care, in colonial lands over the final decades of British rule. By the turn of the century, Kipling's fictional Kim is awarded this very biography, so those who know the book know that Kim gets this book as a reward for good marks, for earning high marks in boarding school and proving himself worthy of colonial service. The dust raised by the 2 Anglo-Sikh wars that brought Punjab under the Pax Britannica by 1849 appeared to have settled soon thereafter, and social life regained its usual rhythm despite mutiny and emergency elsewhere in the colony. The appearance of peace over the decades after Lawrence belied the conflicted future being sown in Punjabi soil. By the time Bedi and his generation were coming of age in the early decades of the 20th century, the imperial peace of Lord Lawrence had given way to political ferment. Even his famous statue would be removed at the heights of anti-colonial upheaval from his public location in Lahore and left to the dinginess of the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta and elsewhere. I think it just kind of falls apart, the statue. So I've been trying to trace the history of the statue. It may have even ended up in Waterloo Station in London. The political contradictions of the Punjab school of colonial governance that Lawrence embodied would take shape slowly yet irrevocably, bringing to a head conflicting imperatives of imperial hegemony. In the Alienation of Land Act of 1900, about which I'll have more to say later, proprietary right founded on liberal principles collided with the customary codes that helped stabilize imperial rule. Imperial rule at that moment took precedence over liberal market principles. In light of that, I want to suggest that the conflicting modalities of colonial statecraft, custom, stability, and order on the one hand, and the potentially destabilizing imperatives of the civilizing mission, the market, social progress, and liberal freedom on the other, will later inform and even take expression in terms of active and passive revolution. Bedi, the progressives, and perhaps his entire generation, so this is a generation of my grandparents, essentially, especially in and around urban centers, came of age straddling the divide between passive and active revolution, working through the relations between the two. Colonial forms of governance since the time of Lord Lawrence made that inevitable. Among the scholars who've explored the relations between liberalism and British Empire most concertedly, Stephen Pincus and David Armitage in English historiography, Ranajit Guha, Thomas Metcalfe, Uday Singh Mehta, and more recently Sir Christopher Bailey in context closer to India, 2 are most relevant for the present purpose of grasping the specific gestation of passive revolution in colonial/post-colonial Punjab, Andrew Sartori and David Gilmartin. Whereas Sartori's work helps ground liberalism, indeed the very presence of liberal thought in the colonial hinterland, quote, in one specific dimension of capitalist society, the sphere of circulation, unquote, Gilmartin's account demonstrates how imperial rule thwarts the radicalizing potential of liberal property laws for the sake of stability, leaving liberal ideals in the colony merely ideational, yet persistent presences before the fact of colonially sanctioned custom. I am firmly convinced, Sir Charles Wood, Secretary of State for India, stated flatly in 1866, that our permanent hold of India would be fearfully loosened if the cultivating population felt that their customary rights were in danger, unquote. The Secretary's concern was shared by many colonial administrators in the wake of the implementation of the permanent settlement of Bengal in 1793 and the instability that its abstract notions of exclusive proprietary right over land had wrought for colonial rule. Sartori's work has eliminated the vernacular valences that began to absorb the new liberal dimensions that the market mediated by colonial rule, of the market mediated by colonial rule. Not only did the theology of Advaita Vedanta become in Rammohun Roy's hands, quote, a doctrine of liberal egalitarianism, unquote, but the logic of commodification and legal codes of commerce penetrated deep into the fabric of Bengali cultural forms. For instance, relatively autonomous groups such as the Kartabhajas and the Sahibdanis, which are sort of local groups in 19th century Calcutta, employed, quote, the logic of commercial society to articulate a political, social, religious, and ethical imagination, unquote. Sartori picks up on the potential for the elaboration and travel of key abstractions intrinsic to the nature of liberal categories and their predication on the abstraction of exchange from use value in following Marx in the Grundrisse. Marx writes, and this is typical Marx, equality and freedom are thus not only respected in exchange based on exchange values, but also the exchange of exchange values is the productive real basis of all equality and freedom. So what does that mean? Sartori elaborates. This, what it means, I think, is, quote, liberalism certainly did not have to await the emergence of a full-blown market society to find its voice. After all, liberal politics advocated as its central social, economic, and political program the extension of free exchange as a model of human interrelations at the expense of other dimensions of the existing forms of social organization, unquote. Considering the revolutionary havoc that the logic of the market could bring to colonial rule, colonial administrators such as Lord Lawrence, C.L. Tupper, and Richard Temple of Punjab had to work in an antinomian fashion and shore up customary patterns to secure imperial longevity. The antinomian structure of British colonial power comes to light in the thrust of Punjab's Alienation of Land Act of 1900. Though scholarship on this significant piece of legislation is now fairly extensive, David Gilmartin's Empire and Islam, Punjab and the Making of Pakistan, best delineates the conflicts underlying it and the consequences it foretold in terms of modalities of political mobilization in the late colonial period. He follows in the wake of observations such as those of David Washbrook, quote, the Anglo-Indian legal system was distinctly Janus-faced and rested on two contradictory principles with different social implications. Whereas the public side of the law encouraged the emergence of free market relations, personal law under the British encouraged the preservation of ascribed traditional status, that's quote-unquote traditional status. In this regard, the law was an indicator of the conflicting purposes of colonial rule itself, unquote. The direct paternalistic style of administration of the Punjab school led to the redaction of customary law under C.L. Tupper, the 1870s and 1880s, and the production of, quote, a class of rural leaders tied closely to the administration, exercising its authority largely in a, quote unquote, tribal or customary idiom by the end of the 19th century. Yet, over the same period, colonial policy in Punjab had created the conditions for an overturning of customary relations, including potentially the overturning of the widely shared custom of prohibiting inheritance of land by daughters. That's one thing that all of the customs shared in common. Gilmartin explains, a late 19th century crisis of indebtedness among Punjabi landholders precipitated the passage of the Alienation of Land Act of 1900. To many British officials, the large-scale expropriation by moneylenders of peasants' land struck close to the heart of British rule, undermining rural stability. Widespread land alienations, many feared, would lead to rural revolt. At its core, however, the issue hinged on the conflict they perceived between a stable agrarian society on the one hand and the free working of natural economic laws on the other, unquote. The colonial state's ruling in favor of custom would have repercussions at every level of Punjabi psychic life. This is something that's explored by the writers, shaping a sense of disjointed time and place in the works of modern writers, especially the progressives. Mahmoud Uzaffar's short story, Javan Mardi, Gallantry, published in the seminal 1932 collection Angare, Embers, is illustrative. It helps one grasp the relation between passive revolution and cultural form. The narrator of the story puts the relationship between himself and his wife in terms of sharp anachronism, the ill fit of traditional domesticity within a wider, modernizing world with all of its libidinal charge and wayward possibilities, for Indian men especially, if not exclusively. Quote, "We were traveling in two different spheres of life, my wife in the narrow and dark alleys of an older era, and I in the clean and broad roads of the new times," unquote. Literatures of the late colonial period display a peculiarly sharp anachrony between a mode of presentation, individuated, self-accounting, agential, and autonomous, and the contents presented, customary practice maintained artificially against the grain of liberal social process. And the very term progressive is a recognition of disjointed times, an existence within retarded temporality of the colonial state's social policies, paternalistic repression and collusion with neo-traditional authorities in cases of censorship, including famously the collection Angare itself. So the book that this story was published in was also banned by the colonial authorities in collusion with Islamic potentates that the British had created. So the point is that progressives think that the only way to deliver on modernity is to get beyond colonialism, because colonialism holds the customary practices intact artificially. So this is a time beyond the antinomy of liberalism and neo-traditionalism under colonial power. Progressivism in all its various shades realized that the project of active revolution made inevitable a war of maneuver with the colonial state. Its members drew out the imminent social potentials of an emergent legal order premised on liberalism and sought to draw those out in turn in an idiom that would speak creatively to the traditionalizing inheritances of colonial power. Facets of everyday liberal practice, such as female servitude, toil, and suffering, found depiction as anomalous remnants of a pre-modern world, practices which would, mutatis mutandis, dissolve if only colonial life worlds were subject immediately to the conditions of the market. How would a future unmoored from traditional dogmas ever reconcile itself with the lingering domestic order with its centripetal gravity, neo-traditional domestic order that sacrificed women to secure its longevity, as Bailey observed in an interview with Ismat Chugtai? In describing this as the cultural form of passive revolution, a note on the term is in order. The concept is generative, fungible, and incomplete, requiring adaptation and elaboration. Gramsci himself took the expression from Vincenzo Cuoco and brought it to his conceptualization of the Risorgimento as a revolution without a revolution, or a passive revolution. Passive revolution thus references a built-in intransigence vis-a-vis social transformation worked into particular social relations, class alliances, and structures of feeling. In the context of the political upheaval in the 19th century, passive revolution refers to, quote, a period of restoration/revolution, unquote, that shudders before the likes of Jacobin Napoleonic formations and seeks to fend them off with, quote, small doses, legally in a reformist manner, in such a way that it was possible to preserve the political and economic position of the old feudal classes, to avoid agrarian reform. India succeeded in that, and especially to avoid the popular masses going through a period of political experience such as occurred in France, unquote, this is Gramsci. In its attempts to stave off the socially revolutionizing potentials of its own policies, the British colonial state produced policies of restoration that were later deployed by nationalist elites and now by neo-traditional right-wing forces, amounting to a movement to firm up familiar forms of social and political hierarchies after the injection of socially transformative and destabilizing energies. This is the logic of it, you could say, that we're still in. What this signifies for our understanding of conflicts in India is that they will likely fall violently on the fault lines between a withering neo-traditionalist passivity and active movements of social transformation, so the market and the home, essentially. What writers like Bedi in the progressive circles realized was the peculiar charge that the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous has in the context of post-colonial now time. The different tempos of the active and passive revolutionary processes do not simply exist side by side in non-synchronicity, but grind against each other, creating peculiar sparks that illuminate the simultaneity of futures unknown. Thank you.